Okay, so welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a quick look at a feature of Windows Forms in Visual Studio, and we're going to be using C#. And that feature is called RadioButtons. And here we have an application that we're working on for another series I'm going to be doing where we make a software simulator of a real-world device called a relay, an electrical relay. And as part of this, we're going to use what you see here on the left is RadioButtons. And if you'll notice, I've got three options, and the RadioButtons allow you to select one of, in this case, three options. And that's a very important point about RadioButtons. It allows you to select only one of a group of options. Now, if you want to select multiple, you would use what's called a checkbox. We're not going to talk about that in this video. But we're going to look specifically at these RadioButtons. Now, as you can see, I've got this first option selected. If I click the second option, the first one gets deselected and the second one gets selected. And that's one important aspect of RadioButtons. Now, in order to implement that, these three RadioButtons need to reside inside what you see, this little box here. In this case, I'm using a group box. And I put a label to it, but I basically moved all of these RadioButtons into this group box, and by doing so it gives you the ability to have only one of the RadioButtons checked. So RadioButtons basically a way to select only one in a group of options. Now there's a couple things you need to think about before you get into RadioButtons in terms of how you're going to implement these. Now in my view there's two main ways you can implement RadioButtons. For example, I'm using this as a passive set of information that I can access in my other code. I can basically just say, hey, what is the present status of these buttons? Which one is selected? So that's one way that you can use these RadioButtons. Another is you can use them so that each time you select one of these, it generates an event, and you can have an event handler that each time you check a box, it goes and does something automatically. Right? So you've got either an active event handler thing, or you've got a passive data source. Again, keep in mind that when I select this first option, all the other options gets deselected. So that's going to be very important because in terms of event handlers, when I select something, two things happen. This first one gets deselected and the second one gets selected. So you have to keep that in mind if you're going to use this as an event and have event handlers. Keep in mind there's going to be two events every time you click on an option. So we're first going to look at having this as just a passive set of data that I can write my other code and say, oh, by the way, what's the state of each of these buttons, so I can decide what to do and there's no event handlers involved. So let's take a look at that in our code. So now here I am in Visual Studio, and we've got a brand new Windows Forms C# application. And you can see I've got the default form here. And what I want to do is I want to set up three RadioButtons so I can select one of three options. The way to do that is the first thing you need to do is we're going to add a group box to group all of those RadioButtons together so that they operate correctly. So I'm going to go down and select group box and drag and drop, and now I've got a group box. What I can do is I can go in here and change the text to selector, and I'm going to change the font to like a 12 font. And you can see here we've got the selector, and now we have a group box that we can drag and drop the RadioButtons on. So I'll go back to the toolbox and go scroll down to RadioButton, and I'm going to add that. And you can see it automatically takes the same font size as the group box. Now I can right click, copy, and then paste, and I'll get RadioButton number 2. And I can paste and I'll get RadioButton number 3. So now I've got three RadioButtons in this group, and we can start this up and we can see that we'll be able to select each one individually. And here's our form. RadioButton 1 is selected. I can select 2 and 3. So now, as I mentioned before, there's a couple ways you can approach this. What we're going to start out with is we're going to add a button, and when we press that button, it's going to go out and check the status of these radio buttons and go off and do something based on that status. We're not going to use event handlers. We're going to do that next. But the first thing we're going to do is just show you how to use the information of these radio buttons by some other code. So I'm going to go to the toolbox, add a button, and I'm going to change the font to a 12 and change the text to start. So here I've got the start button, and I can double click on that, and that'll give me an event handler. And what I can do here is I can go in and find out the status of each of those buttons so that we can use it to do other things. So each time I click the button, it will check the status of the radio buttons to see what the status is. And I can do an if statement. If radio button 1 dot checked, then message box dot show and print a message button 1 checked. And then I can copy and paste those, Control C, Control V, Control V, and if radio button 2 is checked and radio button 3 is checked, 2 and 3. So I can now run it, and I will check radio button 3, start, and I get a message, button 3 is checked. And then I can do 2, message button 2 is checked. So that is a way to have users select one of, in this case, 3 options, and our code can grab that information, go off and do something. Now, like I said, the other way is to have an event handler. Each time I change which button is checked, it will generate an event, which is the radio button checked changed event. So let's see how we can use that. All right, so now what I've done is I've added a text box to give us some feedback on what's going on instead of the message boxes. The text box is a little bit easier, so I got this text box 1, and I made it multi-line, so you can, by doing this arrow up here, you can select multi-line. The only other thing I did is I went up to this radio button 1 and I double-clicked on it to get the event handler for that particular radio button. So let's look at the code we have now. So everything's the same. I've got the start button click. I've commented out the message box show, and here I've got the radio button 1 check changed event handler. So whenever radio button 1 check status changes, it will call this event handler. So what I've done is I have said, okay, text box 1, the text box I've added, append text to say that button 1 was changed. So now let's run this and see what happens as we click the buttons. All right. So it starts out and it knows that button 1 is selected, and it gives this button 1 changed. It may surprise you, but as it starts up, I think it basically checks the status and gives you that event. Now, let's say I click radio button 2. What's going to happen? Are we going to get a radio button 1 check changed event? Well, we'll click it, and yes, we did. We got a button 1 changed. Why did we get that? Well, because button 1 went from checked to unchecked. If I go back to radio button 1 and I click it, it gets changed again. So now what happens if I go to radio button 3? Well, you can see it scrolled and it gave me another button change because radio button 2 was unchecked. Now, what if I go to radio button 2? Nothing happens. This doesn't scroll because radio button 1 wasn't changed. All right, so we don't get an event. So you have to be very careful. You only get events for those buttons that get changed. And if you have, 20 buttons, it's only going to be operating on, a couple buttons at a time. So you're going to have to make sure you understand what's going on, because you might think that it's, any time one of these buttons gets changed, there's an event. No, that's not. You have to look for the status of the individual buttons. So now how are we going to deal with the need to have an event no matter what button is checked? We tried with just a radio button 1 event handler, but it seems like we're going to have an event for each of these buttons. So what I've done is I have moved things around a little bit and lengthened out this text box. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to have an event for each of these. When the checked change event comes, it's going to get a handler for each of these. And let's take a look and see what that looks like. So what I've done, I've got the radio button check changed event we had before, but I've added 2 more events by double clicking on those other radio buttons. And what I've done is I have added a method. No matter which button is called, I call this check which selected, that goes through and checks the status of all of the buttons in the group. And for every event handler, it calls the same method. And here is the check which selected method it calls. All it does, it goes out and says if radio button 1 is checked, then we're going to print to the text box button 1 is checked. Radio button 2 is checked, we're going to print that. If radio button 3 is checked, we're going to print that. This is one way to deal with the issue of needing events for every button. So we've got radio button 1 is checked. We click on radio button 2 and you can see radio button 2 is checked. But keep in mind, like we said before, every time a radio button gets checked, another one gets unchecked. So there's 2 events that are going to happen. Radio button 1 is going to get unchecked, so there's going to be an event handler that's going to call this. And radio button 2 getting checked is going to call this, and that's why we have twice the output. And radio button 3, 2, 1, no matter what, we still get a status of all the buttons. Now the problem is we've got multiple responses, but you can figure out a way to deal with that. But that gives you an idea of how you can set up events for dealing with all of these buttons. So that's about it for this one. If you like any of these videos, please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications. But most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.